Welcome in, guys. This is episode 20 of All In with Adam. I'm here with my buddy Johnathan Greene. It's been a long time since we've had a deep conversation, brother. How are you doing?
It's great, man. I am doing fantastic over here, just trying to make it like everybody else is with the times. I'm really afraid that we're about to lose a lot of gigs again, but I'm trying not to let that keep me down.
Yeah. And I guess for those there's a lot of people listen to this podcast, I think, that don't know either of us from drum world necessarily. And so you're a professional drummer full-time. Is gigging how you make a majority of your income? Are you still doing lessons, things like that?
Man, I'll tell you what, depending on, I'd say every 6 to 8 months, it flips back and forth. So I'll get tons and tons of gigs, and then I'll get lucky and I'll get students when the gigs fall off. And so it's this kind of seesaw effect of it's both. It really is both.
I think one of the things that you're most known for, at least in the drum communities of friends that I run in, right? One of the things, whenever your name comes up, is you are one of the most technical drummers. And I say that talking to like non-drummers and how they could think of your playing, and that it's very, very technical. And, you know, we were just talking before we started rolling today that, you know, I'm privileged to know a lot of different drummers, all sorts of ones. Some that are absurdly famous, and some that are highly technically skilled, and the whole gamut. And not all of them are suited for being podcast guests necessarily, because I have to apply this filter of, you know, have we had deep conversations before, or interesting conversations? And for all of the technicality in your playing, you know, I recall some of the past conversations we've had, and you've got a technicality in your thinking as well, you know. And so I just wanted to mention that I remembered some of these excellent conversations that we had at NAMM, specifically, a big music convention from several years ago. And so I'm excited to dive into some of those topics, because you and I have not necessarily kept up, at least in a very like deep or meaningful way, over the last few years. But I remembered from the quality of those past conversations that I think this would be a really good one.
Well, I definitely was, again, shocked with, this is like me referencing something that's not even on the podcast. But yeah, with the openness, I guess, in that little house that we were in with all those drummers, how everybody just kind of spoke their mind. And yeah, if I remember correctly, we talked a little about Sam Harris and atheism and these just types of, and I was like, oh my gosh, man. And I want to talk to this guy more, because I live in North Carolina. You're in Florida, so I'm preaching to the choir here. But
hey, yeah.
You know,
Bible Belt all day.
Right. But since then, it's interesting because I feel like the state of atheism, the state of just the world, is way different than when we had that little encounter before.
Very, very different. Yeah, and I would imagine both of us have had somewhat of shifting in views. I mean, it's hard to be a deep thinking person, I suppose, and not have your views, you know, sort of knocked around every couple years in one way or another. Where do you line up in terms of let's just say the straight down the middle rationalist Sam Harris sort of position? Like, do you still find yourself in that camp, relatively speaking?
I definitely pick and choose a lot more than I used to. Because I find myself shifting left more as I get older, which is a counter to what I was told that I would do as a kid, that, you know, you get more conservative as you get older. And I don't think that's the case. I think that oftentimes we sort of just get stuck in our ways without really learning anything. And as I sort of take the same critical lens as I've taken to my Christianity outward, and deconstruct a lot of things, I find that I don't agree with a couple of, like, there are some things that with Sam specifically, that I don't agree with the intellectual dark web, as it were.
Sure.
There are just certain sides of things that I can't get behind, where before, maybe I wasn't engaging with that side at all, or I wasn't made aware of it, because my friends and the landscape that I exist in has definitely changed. I know way more LGBTQ people, and just more like the people that I know have just changed me, I think.
Okay.
And so when somebody, like, let's say that somebody says that their outlook on gender is biological, then I think about, okay, so what are you saying? Because these people are separating the ideas of gender from biological sex. Are you going to engage with what they're actually saying? Or are you going to use this weird type of reductionist argument to say that, like, well, biological sex exists and we have some sort of like naturalistic imperative to fit some sort of like predetermined social role?
That issue definitely comes up where people, they're arguing within different domains at the same time, right? Someone pitches a biological argument and someone else says, well, I'm talking about social constructionism, biology completely set aside. And then you have this weird disconnect. And, you know, I feel like I brought this up in a couple of recent episodes, but do you remember a few years ago where Trump had this, I cannot remember her name, but Trump had a woman who was like a representative of his administration, and she got made fun of for saying that Trump used alternative facts in a situation. Do you remember that phrase, alternative facts?
Yep.
And I remember thinking that was extremely funny at the time, like what a stupid thing to say. But it was recently explained to me that in any given situation, there are an unlimited or an infinite number of facts that can be extracted. And so, for example, if I asked you to list facts about the room that you're in, well, you can certainly say that there's a drum set to your right and that there is a red thing on the door behind you and that the microphone you're talking into is likely black. But if you go to the molecular level, well, there's infinite little scratches and markings and all these textures on a microscopic level that are facts about the room. So the set of facts that you extract from a certain situation can color your opinion. And I think a lot of times this is why there's these weird disconnects in a discussion of gender, let's say, because someone extracts the biological facts and someone else extracts a set of sociological facts, and then they try to weigh those against each other when you're not even in the same ballpark necessarily. And it's difficult to, how do you mend those two things together and have a rational conversation when people are starting in different cities, you know?
Yeah, you definitely have to, because there is some logic 101 that kind of needs to be gone over in order to approach the conversation. This idea that like something cannot be like the same yet different. It can't be. You can't have a contradictory statement in the same way at the same time, right? A can't be A and not A. And so you have to dial in the context first. But the problem that I have when I talk to people is, even when we dial in on the context, there are these defense mechanisms that occur that kind of allow us to sidestep or escape inconvenient truths. Because, so I had a conversation, and I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, but I did have a conversation recently with probably a mutual drummer friend or two. And we talked about things like flat Earth, right? And I feel like the core of flat Earth is this weird type of hyper skepticism where you have almost like in a new Earth type of young Earth creationism. We don't know anything about history because no one was there. And so the deductive formulas we use to derive the closest thing that we could call facts. Oh no, that's my GoPro. I'm sorry about that. It just cut off.
You're good.
And we figure out these systems of what we would consider objective fact that don't have any type of relevance or have any type of utility at all in the real world.
Okay.
You would never say, I don't believe something because there is a smallest possibility that it might be wrong, right? So if I say the core of the Earth, we are fairly aware that the core of the Earth is made of nickel, say. And, well, how do you know that? Because no one has ever been there. It's like, well, we have these things called spectral lines, which allows us to actually not just tell what is in the center of the Earth using light, but also stars that are light years and light years away. Well, the person could easily say, well, that's all well and good, but how do you know that's accurate? How do you, like, unless somebody is there observing the thing, and even if they come back, you're not the one doing it. So it's still like a level like removed from any type of fact that I personally can verify. And we get into the space where, can anything actually be confirmed? We get into this like Laplace's demon-esque type of place where reality doesn't exist.
I've made the same observation from looking at the flat Earth community with an honest set of eyes and ears, really trying to see how does this even happen? And it is a skepticism that is rooted in people not wanting to trust things that they cannot verify, which is understandable to a degree. It's just drawing that line is very tricky. And I think one line that I draw that has helped me decide, where I'm comfortable placing some version of faith, or whether or not I'm okay leaving some skepticism open, is things that I can verify to a certain degree. So, like, for example, I do not know how my iPhone works. Like, I have no fucking clue. I know there's probably a transistor. I know there's probably a computer chip. I mean, I have some vocabulary words that I can list off of things that probably happen inside of here, but I really don't have a grasp on the actual technology in any substantial way. But I do know that my cell phone works, and it always works. It works reliably. It works in a lot of different ways. And so it would seem to be a waste of my time to question the validity of cell phone science. It seems to be pretty good. We can say this about airplanes, about a lot of things. But when we're talking about certain things where I cannot possibly verify to any degree how many gallons of water are in the ocean, how many miles away the moon is, given I'm not trying to verify those things, but it is at least more understandable that someone would live with a certain amount of skepticism because, you're trusting a team of scientists who you don't know, who use tools that you can't name. Even if I gave you all the tools or let you into the laboratory, you don't know how any of this shit works. You can't even turn the machine on. You don't know what it's measuring or how to measure it. And so it reminds me of that classic episode of It's Always Sunny, where they talked about, they talked about the Bible pouring through, all of these ancient writings and letters, and you're trusting the opinions of all of these people whom you do not know. But then you could make the same argument if you were on Team Science. Have you poured through the data, the numbers, the figures? And so there is this irony to that. But of course, this doesn't make either of us flat earthers necessarily, but it is interesting to entertain that level of skepticism, and there is an argument there for being that skeptical. But how do you draw those lines, right? Like, what do you believe in, and how do you determine whether or not it's worthy of your belief, right? That's a hard question.
I think I first have to separate things into, are there things that there is a clear path for my understanding? Like, I could not easily, that's stupid, but there is a possible world in which I went to college for computer science, right? If right now my curiosity overtook me, it is not impossible for me to educate myself to the extent in which I could understand how to build an iPhone, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But there are certain things that doesn't exist in. Like, there are certain types of knowledge that the fields of study don't exist. And all those tend to be more the spiritual, mystic, religious aspects. And so anytime that there's a scientific question, I tend to first check to see if any of my biases toward the establishment are going to get in the way of understanding or accepting certain things. Because I already love science, as it were. If vaccines are a great example. When the vaccine happened, when the whatever it's called, the
mRNA.
Thank you. Thank you. The first thing I did was read the Pfizer paper on the actual vaccine. That was the first thing, because I was so curious as to how it worked, how long the process was being worked on, which, that's different than how long it took to develop the COVID vaccine in particular, right? Mm-hmm. The process of this specific type of vaccine has been in development since 1998 or something like that. So I am always so interested in breakthroughs. And then whenever this was coming, I said, okay, what else? Because I know that if this is a viable, if I interacted with it like it's a real viable scientific breakthrough, the thing that I would expect are other vaccines, right? I would expect them to work on AIDS and cancer and malaria and other things that we haven't necessarily cracked yet. Come to find out that it's expected, for the HIV mRNA vaccine to start phase 1 this year.
Wow.
Right. And
wow.
I mean, that's not on the news because COVID is on our minds and that's the thing that's being politicized, right? But before you know it, and this happened to me a couple of years ago when I discovered that they had a vaccine for a new hepatitis that I didn't realize that they had. And it's no fanfare, no nothing. It just got added quietly to the schedule. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that we had a vaccine for that now. And I feel like as long as it's like that, no one cares, right? As long as it's not pertaining to an emergency or whatever, or if it's the type of pandemic or an epidemic rather, that doesn't affect us in the States, then it's fine. But as soon as we have to do something, look out. All of a sudden we're, So I noticed that it was basically business as usual across the board. And I mean, that can be good or bad, depending on the bad case about the pharmaceutical industry is primarily it's off-label use for a lot of things. They'll quietly start recommending medication for something that it's not approved for. And they've gotten into a lot of trouble doing things like that. But with so many eyes sort of forward on this, it just didn't make sense. It seemed like skepticism that wasn't skepticism towards the industry wasn't necessarily skepticism towards the science. And any type of argument that I heard towards the vaccine never addressed what the vaccine actually did. It always affected things like motive and all of these other things that gets very teamsy for me.
Well, I'm in a weird camp, and I definitely understand the teamsy element of it for sure. I think one thing I've learned, this might be helpful to cover before I say my opinion on vaccines necessarily, but I think the team element of it, where it's you are either pro-vaccine, pro-science, or you're an insane anti-vaxxer, I really don't like that group distinction, because I think there's a lot of really valid gray area in between those two camps. And that's where I find myself many of the times. My view of the vaccine, I think it is a modern miracle of medicine and science that such a thing could even exist at all. I think it's incredible that we can put any type of a chemical in our body that could prevent us from getting some sort of disease, whether it's COVID or anything else, polio or Spanish flu, or it's incredible that these exist at all. But I am of the belief that when I think about putting an exogenous man-made chemical into my body, my thought is I think about something a lot less controversial like Advil, right, or Tylenol, and I will do a whole lot of things to alleviate my headache symptoms before I resort to putting that exogenous pharmaceutical drug into my body. And I know that it's safe. I know it's not necessarily, well, safe is a weird word to say. I know that it's not going to cause me innate danger in the present moment. It might not be the best for my stomach lining, and there's arguments to be had. But the point being, I would prefer to take the homeopathic route if that is at all on the table. And so when I assess the death rate of COVID, when I assess my diet, my exercise regimen, how I feel about my general health, the lack of, I'm not immunocompromised. I don't have any, pre-existing conditions. I'm not obese. I've never had any respiratory issues. When I assess all of that and the likelihood of me dying from COVID or getting it and irresponsibly spreading it to other people, which I certainly wouldn't do. To me, all of this results in, why would I put this exogenous chemical in my body? And I think the unfortunate answer for many people is fear, is why they would put it in their body. They may be in the same circumstance that I'm in, where they would gladly chug a bottle of water before they had Advil. They would rather take a nap, or they would rather adjust their diet if they were having a stomach problem instead of taking a gastrointestinal medication, right? People behave this way all the time. But when you introduce the element of fear, and you're told to be scared in over many, many, many months, because admittedly, when this first happened, it was significantly scarier than it was shortly after. I think that is a primary motivator for many people. And I do not like the idea of putting an exogenous chemical in your body on the premise of your fear. That's very bothersome to me. It's one of the reasons that I don't have the vaccine. Is I'm just not scared. I should also clarify, I had COVID actually. It sucked. It was a flu, but I'm pretty confident that I'm young and healthy and do a lot of things to proactively take care of my body. Anyway, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that particular perspective.
Wow, because that was a lot. I sort of agree with you, especially knowing sort of how you are. You do take good care of yourself. I know you watch what you eat. I know you don't drink, and those other things. And so, like, there is a consistency that makes it a little bit different to talk to you about this than it does with someone else that will use a similar argument. But I realize that there are these inconsistencies with that argument through their lifestyle. So,
okay, sure.
It's a very interesting thing to bring up. The fear thing, I think, is where I would start, because I think the issue with that is framing. Whenever I think about how the vaccine was introduced, I think about, because it was introduced into the Trump era, right? And I'm no fan of Trump, but I went on the record of saying that, like, I feel like that was the best thing that he'd ever done, or at least the best thing that he had ever gotten behind, right?
Okay.
Because my dislike of Trump didn't affect the way that I thought about, like, vaccines or that, like, area of science in general. And so it really has. So you could go two routes here. You could think about, like, when we talk about fear, I don't think you use the framing of fear to take care of yourself or to not do certain things, even though you know that if you stop taking care of yourself, if you start, like, drinking heavily or whatever, it's going to produce negative outcomes, right? So, but you never use the framing of fear to avoid those outcomes. So it's interesting how you think about that as being different, maybe because of it being an internal motivation versus an external motivation with the vaccines, especially since it's pushed on you by the government and media outlets, specifically on the left. You see what I'm saying? Like, to me, apart from the internal external thing, there doesn't really seem to be a different motivation for getting the vaccine, because we're both hopefully going towards the same ends, like health and well-being.
Sure. Yeah, I do understand. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think it's a tricky one, man. It's really tricky. I'm curious, what are your thoughts of the various camps of people that are unvaccinated? There's many reasons to not be vaccinated. You've heard mine, obviously, but what is your perspective on the left and the what I would perceive, maybe you would disagree, but I would perceive it as a very intolerant view of those who are merely unwilling to get vaccinated. That, obviously in New York, there's new lockdowns. Vaccine passports are a very real thing now. Do you see, as someone who is oriented towards the left, do you see a line that cannot be crossed when it comes to verifying whether or not someone has put a chemical in their body? So
the thing that comes to mind when getting into this type of conversation is constitutionality, and it's not, is it constitutional? It's precedent. The things that we use ID for in this country, and the things that we defend not needing ID to have, right? Because any type of ID or traceable anything on the gun argument tends to fuel cries towards communism. There are camps that I have observed that have a very, very libertarian perspective on gun ownership because it's in the Constitution, right? That the government really should have no business getting in the way in any shape or form in regulating or controlling the amount, types, or the people that would have guns in this country. And there are a few exceptions, even though these things are contentious. People that have felonies, people that have mental health concerns,
sure,
whatever. And
but
so
there's no database for guns, right? Ultimately, right? That's a big line in that discussion. Sure,
that's kind of my point. And so when I think about things like that, I think about that to me is the direct analogy to, because we're allergic to databases, even though like we're all, we all have Social Security, like the government knows where we are, what we do, how much money we make, like all of these things. And it's interesting the lines that we draw. I sit from the left, because I think that some of the things I'm about to say actually cut both ways. It's this idea of teams and some virtue signaling. This idea that because there is a view that the left is the logical scientific party, that it is the thing that that's our flag. And it's easy for us to beat down because like facts and whatever, even though for some strange reason, facts don't care about your feelings is a slogan on parts of the other side.
Shapiro,
I don't know if I really have an answer to that question, because I am not necessarily interested ever in the sides thing. I am only really interested in comparing arguments and seeing if I can figure out like if there are trends in like belief in how we defend like our beliefs in these types of situations.
So I think one of the things this type of conversation gets us into is honestly role of government, like big picture. What is it precisely that people like you and I would want from the government? And I should clarify, I don't identify as a purist conservative by any means, but as you mentioned, you've grown older and you find yourself orienting towards the left. I've honestly found the opposite. I orient towards the right in my natural disposition a bit more. For me, when I think about role of government, I've grown more accustomed to the idea of a smaller government. And the problem that I run into is that I tend to like when we shrink the ideal government down to its original purpose, which we're very far away from in this country. But the original purpose of government was to protect the natural rights of individuals. Now, natural rights are already kind of a debatable territory, because deciding what rights you have that are innate, that we don't actually create, but rather you're born with them, we're kind of dancing in belief in God territory, right? Like, who says you have the right to speak? Because if we don't, you're saying that the universe does, right? That you have this innate human value. And of course, one of the coolest things the Founding Fathers did was negotiate those rights. They didn't just say, it's not blind religion, like the Bible said you have a right to speak, therefore freedom of speech. We negotiate what those are. An example of that would be libel and slander and defamation, and it's not infinite speech, but we negotiate these things. And that was the original purpose of the American government, was here's your natural rights. We've got a list of them. We're going to make sure that nobody infringes upon them. And there was no other function of that government. So when we get into something as complex as like government infusing into the private healthcare system in this weird fucking way, like regulating marijuana laws when it's legal in certain states and not in others. We have this disconnect of the federal and the state level law. Like, this to me is so outside of the government's scope. It's not at all what it was intended to actually do. Really, what the government was intended to do is just make sure that nobody violates our rights. And beyond that, everything belonged to us. And so when we get into, I don't know, some of the ideologies of the left that would like to play the role of the nurturing mother, so to speak, where the government can solve problems for you, it can help you and meet these needs for you. My response as someone who orients slightly conservatively is, I want precisely nothing from the government other than protection of my rights. And everything else, I think we the people can do a significantly better job at solving those problems. But I'm curious how that strikes you as someone left-oriented.
I think that there are a couple of things that the government wasn't. Okay, first of all, as a black person, it's hard for me to think about what the government was meant for originally, because we are already, like, my people were already not a consideration in the original form of the United States government and Constitution. And so I am already on the side of, there are certain things that we need to throw out, but we have to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Sure.
That makes me sound like a centrist a little, right? Because I'm not for I'm not radically like trying to destroy the American government or the Constitution or anything like that, right? I think that's where leftists kind of get a bad rap. We want to deconstruct things and figure out what is working and what isn't. And if something isn't working, not just to throw it out, but why? Because it's like you have all of these programs that oftentimes either get gutted before their original intentions are ever seen, or they have the proper legs to do what they need to do. And then the other side, because I'm not going to do the right does this and the left does this, all these are political games. But the other side can easily just say, hey, we tried it your way, even though that never happened, and see what happened. You guys failed. And it's like, no, I mean, we failed because not everybody was on board. I'm not like a utopian person. I'm not expecting everybody to like hold hands and do the kumbaya thing, but we have to also call a spade whenever you have a, the type of government that we have, which is a very contentious, like adversarial government. Like we are always, and on some level, looking for the scraps of whatever the other side will compromise with. And that is something that we have our founding fathers to thank for,
yes.
Right? Like the way that, and because they thought that an adversarial government was the best form. And now I could see how a couple of ways that's not the truest thing. I mean, the easiest idea is wartime. Right? The president would not have emergency powers if the founding fathers did not see it fit to say, okay, there are some times that exist in life that we have to be led apart from like the populace's opinions. Right? That's and so it doesn't matter what conservative I talk to. The army, the armed forces are something that most conservatives that I talk to abide, because they understand that is what you were talking about, protecting freedom or protecting like the rights instilled by whomever. But the question to me is that the only thing? Like, are we as individual citizens equipped to deal with literally everything else except for war?
Well, arming a population certainly factors into that a little bit. Well, I am curious.
True.
Yeah. Well, so I am curious about the idea that that eternal battle, like you said, it's an adversarial government. The entire setup of the American government is definitely adversarial, and it was intended to be that way infinitely, that just fight it out into eternity sort of thing. But to drag this conversation into the philosophical realm, are you familiar with the concept of, it's called different things, but universal polarity, which would be like chaos and order?
It sounds like something that I heard Jordan Peterson reference.
It's a bit once. Jordan Peterson, yeah, and Jonathan Piaget, Carl Jung. It's sort of in that camp. Okay. So we're dancing with the mystics a little bit. But the idea would be that in many different domains, let's start with an easy one like microscopic levels. So we've got positive and negative ions. There's sets of 2. We go to hormones. We have testosterone and estrogen. There's sets of 2. We go to sex and gender. Obviously, we can branch that conversation off. But, biologically speaking, and only biologically speaking, there are males and females across all species. We can go through many, many, many different domains, even in personality distinctions of someone who is very tactical or militant versus someone who is open and extroverted and creative. There's this spectrum of chaos and order, or how things are and how things could be. That's another way to say it. And the idea would be that if you apply that filter of chaos and order to the parties, the Progressive Scientific Party, which is the party of all things creative. That's why it's all music, all Hollywood, all actors, all creative types seem to be oriented towards the left. It's very forward thinking, it's scientifically minded, but it's the creative party by all means. And then the party of order, the party who loves guns and military and, tradition, the party that's predominantly more religious. That's clearly the party of order. And when you take chaos and order and you set them at each other and you make them dance forever, this sort of seems to be how chaos and order work. It's how they work in every other domain you could find an example, right? Like, you can't have all positive ions. You need positive and negative. You can't have all testosterone. You have to have a balance of estrogen. There are very predetermined, almost like natural law that predetermines the ratio of chaos and order in different domains. There's a ratio of testosterone to estrogen in our body. And if we fuck with that, you're going to be pretty miserable. There's like a dance that happens naturally. And so my thought about the American government is to create the most powerful nation that has ever existed in human history, the cultural epicenter of the world. In 200 plus years only, just that short amount of time, we seem to be the first culture that set up chaos and order to dance forever and said, here's the proper way to orient yourself within the world. It's to take these ideologies, which are historically have been at war with each other. I mean, we have Judeo-Christianity, which is natural law and hard religion, versus Aristotle's, Greek reason. But America seems to marry those two things together. And the founding fathers said, how about you guys just fight it out forever? And in 200 years, we have the most powerful cultural epicenter that the world has ever seen. And so I can't help but wonder if we're doing precisely what is supposed to be done.
That's a very interesting story. It's interesting that, I think that we'll never get tired of the chaos and order because for some reason we like binaries, even though that doesn't necessarily always pan out in nature either. From the fundamental forces, I mean, sure, they're like positives and negatives, and really that's just a description of interactions between certain elements or certain between magnetic poles to ions, as you were talking about. We use those words to describe their relationship with each other, not as sort of like an essential quality that positiveness and negativeness in like a Pluto, like that type of sense, like the world of forms, like there is a essence of positive and essence of negative. I think that oftentimes we tell those stories descriptively and then we use those stories prescriptively. There is and my little example has to do with the animal species thing. It's like we could talk about male and female, but even that is contextual because there are plenty of species that biologically change between male and female in their life cycle, depending on the circumstances. If there are not a lot of males, they'll actually switch sexes, right? And that's nothing to talk about the species that procreate asexually, right? Not even, I don't want to talk about their evolutionary viability, because there's this thing about gene mixing and how that makes you stronger as you grow and because you're blah blah blah. But the story of binaries, as useful as it is, I wonder if that is actually not only is it true, I have to question, is that good for us? Because it's interesting that, you say chaos and order, but part of that chaos is not only the ingenuity of industry and the manifest destiny-ness of the pioneering American spirit. It is the fact that we were also racist and we thought that we had a God-given claim to certain things, and other cultures and other people be damned. Now, you have to look at both sides of that coin to sort of see where we are. And so I feel again, that's a cool framing of it. But whenever you look at certain elements through a microscope, it seems like you have like 3 poles. You have like positive, negative, and neutral.
Right. Okay.
Where you can have.
I see what you're saying. I think one of the things that makes chaos and order so hard to describe in these binary terms, and why you would argue that, hey, it doesn't seem to be that binary, is because they're like eternally dancing would be the philosophical way. That's the Jordan Peterson way to say that. And so it is,
sure,
because clearly you're not an entity of testosterone, right? You have to have estrogen in your body or it's a total nightmare. So to say you are one or the other is incorrect. It is not really binary. It's sort of like the 1 and the 0 have to merge into this weird new number, and that's kind of neutral. And
sure.
And very much in the same way, like I'm of the belief that gender expression is very clearly fluid. We very clearly have biological men who act quite feminine, and we would have biological females who act quite male. And I think the dancing of chaos and order, theoretically, is one of the things that makes it so hard to pin down what is chaos and what is order, and how you would really put those in 2 separate camps. But I think they're just so infinitely smashed together that it's very, very tough. Political ideologies are the same way. It's a shame when people make politics so deeply binary and separate these parties, when in reality, everyone should be all across this very, very nuanced spectrum. Of course, I hope that's the case. We're taught that it's really not, but I think many people, that's actually the case. They have very, very conservative ideals, depending on the topic, and then they might go very liberal, depending on another topic. But I'm curious, big picture, you said you find yourself orienting more left. In what ways specifically do you find yourself gravitating towards I suppose, a more like constructionist view, as opposed to the God-fearing view would be the alternative?
Well, there are certain libertarian conversations, and I guess libertarian left is the idea where, because any libertarian that is a free market libertarian would usually grant that we don't actually live in a free market right now. Like the government and business they're so intertwined with each other that we don't know what a free market society truly looks like. And that could be on 2 different levels. It could be on more the conservative side, that businesses are regulated to death. Mm-hmm. And the things that businesses have to actually give as far as like permits and zoning, to what they have to give to their employees, all the way to standards like minimum wage and mandatory days off and things like that. All of those things should be outside of the purview of government.
Wow, that's not particularly left-leaning of you to say that. Yeah.
Right. That's what I'm saying. But I'm actually talking about a libertarian perspective.
I agree. I agree completely.
There are a couple of things. So Joe Rogan was talking to, I think, Dave Rubin on his podcast, and he was actually very supportive to government regulation in certain contexts, like construction. He was talking about how he was in construction before, like as a kid, because his dad was an architect, and he was talking about how like all he saw were like dirtbags trying to cheat the system, because if you have a system that's a profit motive, and you're trying to get things done as fast and as cheaply as humanly possible, you know that time is money, and you know that like if you can move on to the next job, the more money you'll make, and what he said was, without some sort of oversight and without someone going back and checking and making sure that you actually did these things correct, that people were dirtbags, especially in construction, because those types of problems were not immediate. You could have a home and problems with that home won't manifest 5-10 years down the road, right? Mm-hmm. And it just puts a lot of onus, almost to wrap things back around to the scientific skepticism argument, where we know that we don't have the bandwidth to be experts in absolutely everything that we do. It's like free market capitalism in its Wild West sense would require a populace so educated and so like savvy to the way markets work that like we have to, like that's what it would take for us to be rational actors in that type of situation.
Yeah.
Because we wouldn't have a proxy in order to deal with. We would have to be like, because there'd be nothing in between us and that person that may be good or bad. That's sort of the argument against that type of free market libertarianism.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned earlier in this podcast, you mentioned there's certain games that certain things that we've attempted to roll out in government, but we don't fully play the game till its final conclusion. We don't let ideas actually get fleshed out all the way. And part of the pushing and pulling nature of the government is why it's hard to let things play out when an administration flips every 4 years and they can undo everything that was done. And I do understand that's a really valid point, but when we talk about like removing code from like a construction company, for example, so they can cut corners, and if profit is the primary motivator, that they would cut many, many corners. Some companies certainly would do this, and that those problems would manifest themselves, all throughout the country for, and who knows how long it's going to take for that game to reach its final conclusion. But I want to give you one really weird example of when the government never stepped in and we let a game run its course all the way through to the final conclusion. Have you ever seen the documentary on HBO called Action Park?
Yes.
You seen it? About that fucked up water park up in New Jersey?
Yep.
Right. Okay. So for those that don't know, I'll give like a brief synopsis of it. It was like the first water park in the whole country. There were no rules, no regulations on any kind of place like this because it had never existed before. So like, I mean, they had water slides that had nails sticking out of them. They were going to Home Depot or Lowe's and just buying some plywood and building crazy shit for teenagers to jump off of. Teenagers were working as lifeguards. They were totally untrained. They had go-karts there and all these weird things that you could rent. Kids were taking them out after hours. It was horrible. There was a few kids that died. Tons and tons of injuries, concussions, broken legs, lacerations. It was brutal. And somehow, despite there being a lot of like legal attention on this place, the game that was Action Park was allowed to run its course. It was never actually shut down by the government. There were some lawsuits and there were some threats, but it was never actually deemed to be the egregious place that it was, and it was left open. And what happened was, after this long period, almost 2 decades of chaos at this place, on a cultural level, people just stopped going. They just stopped going to the super dangerous water park because the stories collectively just changed people's impression of what this place was. It wasn't this fun adventure anymore. It was kind of like, yeah, fuck that place, man. You're probably going to get hurt. And people stopped going. And to me, this was an example of allowing a truly free market to run its course. It's very slow and it's very dangerous. And yes, people are definitely going to get hurt along the way. But ultimately, you're left with the right decision was made by the people, and that place no longer exists because it literally just classically went out of business. Nobody wants to go here anymore. And so I think about when we have construction companies who are no longer regulated in their building code by the government. Yes, they're going to build shitty houses. They're going to build a lot of them, and it's going to take a long time for those houses to fall apart when the hurricane comes or when the storm blows through. It's going to take a long time to figure out who those people are. But I'm of the belief that those people who act without integrity, who cut all of the corners that they can, that they are existentially doomed, that a free market does not support these types of people for a very long time. And so it's almost like if we can bite our tongues for 20 years, a truly free market, we're almost borderline like anarchist territory where everything is truly ours. I do believe that a fully free market society with no government regulation at all, I think it can survive. I just think it's 20 years of chaos until we get there, much like the closing of Action Park. It takes a long time for culture to catch up.
Yeah, but the calculus of the people that get hurt or will die,
it's very different.
I think as a lefty, as a lefty, that's where I come in and I'm like, okay, like I care about loss of life and are these certain things, is my ideal of freedom worth that? Like, because it's not even, let's say, freedom. Because like freedom is used as such a weird type of buzzy thing that I feel like when people say freedom, like you're taking my freedoms away, or like I stand for freedom, or as people should have as many freedoms as possible. I agree with that to the extent that I feel like people should be able to do what they want as long as it doesn't hurt others.
Mm-hmm.
But when people are hurting others, like, I feel like that is action park, right? And I feel like if there's a human cost to the corrective nature of the slow corrective nature of the free market, and there is a system that could do that better as to not have such a human cost, I feel like that avenue should be explored.
Well, there is a distinction in there, though, and it's a difficult distinction to articulate, but it is the difference between positive and negative rights. So you said, right,
yeah.
right, and this is one of the things that this is how you would pitch the argument for leaving Action Park open, is that you had the right, or rather, the individuals that went and got injured chose to go there and participate in the game that was Action Park, right? And of course, you don't want malicious characters to be intentionally harming people that go to Action Park, right? That's certainly a different thing, but that's a positive action on their part, rather than saying, we made a dangerous water park and you can come or not come. To me, that is like, it sounds really weird, but that's a fundamentally American idea, that there's dangerous elements of this adventure, but you have the right to choose. Or another example, here's a better one: predatory lending.
Can we stay on the Action Park for a second?
Sure.
Because I feel like there's still some untapped thing in there. Like, for instance, like, I wouldn't expect. So I feel like you're right. That is a definite part of, like, American culture, with that danger and, like, risking your life. Like, you know, you could talk about skydiving or whatever.
Knife juggling.
Have, like, risk. But I don't consider... I would make the argument that the initial crowds of people that went to this park did not consider that a theme park would be in the same category as some of these extreme types of entertainment, as, you know, I just mentioned. So I mean, what does that say? So sure, that is a part of our society, but shouldn't we have some reasonable expectations about the things that we're either purchasing or the experiences that we, like, sign up for?
I think, well, that's a complicated question. I mean, in a utopia, yeah, we should have plenty of expectations. Of course, we know that will always be bad actors out there in every domain. There's always going to be those people. But it's a question of, if we take Papa government out of the equation altogether, get rid of all of those regulations, and you run the game to its conclusion, which is like, let the free market go for, and seriously, a very, very ridiculous amount of time, maybe 50 years, to find out how this sort of thing stabilizes. Like, I don't know that the experiment of true Wild West free market capitalism has ever really, really been run, because people will make the argument that the left does and say, hey, look, people are clearly getting fucked over. Can't we do something about this? And the answer is yes, you can do something about it, hence all of the regulations that we live under now. And many of them are quite easy to appreciate. Like, I'm glad that there's building codes. I'm sure glad that the plane you and I go to fly somewhere in has been inspected, right? Like, that sounds pretty good. But what happens if we remove all regulation and does Western capitalism, free market society, if it was left truly alone, does it solve these problems eventually? And that's sort of my question. I'm not saying it wouldn't be incredibly dangerous in the path to get there. A whole lot of people are going to die. Planes are going to fall out of the sky. Action parks are going to pop up all over the place and kill a bunch of people. That's definitely going to happen. But I wonder if the game's conclusion might be that only trustworthy people of integrity are even invited to play the game, because it's the only game in town, is the one where you don't fuck people over, right? Because, I mean, how long can a corporation exist cutting corners? You know, does the government serve as a crutch to those sort of people, allowing them to play these in and out games forever?
This is an interesting perspective, and this is something that I thought about as soon as it brought the topic up. Okay. Because on the other side, you could talk about corporate welfare being like such that that's exactly what government does in most cases. And a lefty like me would blame the role of money in politics as the cause. This idea that you have undue influence by these bad actors that basically allow for cover for corporations to do like misdeeds.
Yeah, good example.
Like, from the banking
housing crisis yeah.
to, I think it was Purdue, and it was a drug. It was a drug that a lot of people were like an opioid replacement that like was getting mishandled and caused a lot of addiction. I can't remember. But it was this type of like off-label use situation, where you already have those outcomes. The thing that I guess I'm concerned about isn't death. Mm-hmm. It's more death than we have now, right? People are always going to die. How much more death is tolerable than like the average? Like how much more above the average?
Yeah, it is.
And that's almost back to the COVID argument, right? Like, do we expect like if everything is to be believed, is it acceptable that there is an uptick of like 500,000 or 600,000 people in the situation that we're in, above the average of the past 3 or 4 years? Like, is that something that is worth doing mask mandates or occupancy restrictions or vaccines? I land on the yes camp because, I mean, I feel like the science, if we looked at it apart from values, apart from freedom and like the role of government in society, if we just looked at the injection, I am convinced as of right now that the vaccine itself, if it's not preventative, and if it's not like, okay, it's going to shield you and give you some protection, because there's some evidence to show that like the damage done by COVID is alleviated by this vaccine, not just the fact that because breakthrough cases are not a surprise. Like if you remember, they talked about the percentages of people that would still get COVID even after the vaccine, right? But they were trying to mitigate the amount of deaths by COVID. So if you take all that into account, I believe that if the vaccine, if it's not beneficial, then the worst it is to me is it's benign, right? So because what I haven't seen are consistent studies on a large scale showing that it is. I mean, I am aware of the Israeli myocarditis stuff and what happened with Johnson & Johnson. I know about the various database. I've known that because I've talked about vaccines with people for years and years and years. But to me, I don't think that it has been shown that taking the vaccine itself is harmful.
Well, I think one of the sketchy territories of that conversation is that the approval that it got from the FDA was not a standard approval by the FDA. It was for an emergency purpose, right? So it hasn't been given the same level of testing that virtually all other vaccines have. And I get really troubled. You know, Fauci had a specific thing he was talking about in a video I saw recently where he said, you know, many women are concerned for purposes of fertility. They're concerned that this would cause fertility problems down the road because clearly that has not been tested yet. I mean, the babies who were conceived in a vaccinated mother are either not born or they're certainly not adults yet, right? So there are some elements of unknown. It's just untestable at this point in time. And, you know, Fauci, the world-leading expert on this particular topic, his best explanation was, you know, babies are still getting born. You know, and for me, I think it is very valid to say that's not good enough. That is not evidence enough that there is nothing, that it is merely benign. To me, the verdict that the vaccine is purely benign can't possibly be in yet. Now that might be more than likely that even if it's totally ineffective, that at the very least it would be benign. My argument would be that there's not enough data to make a conclusion like that, right? I mean, especially when we're talking about time-sensitive or rather, things like pregnancy and fertility, which take at least 9 months for the child to develop, and then these children have to grow up, and we have to make sure that they don't have any other type of condition, right?
So there are a couple of things, because this is one of those conversations where details are hopefully they're important. What are the types of things that would affect pregnancy, or what are the types of things that we would expect to affect pregnancy? What is the makeup of the vaccine, and what does it actually do? And given what we know about vaccines and our immune responses, is there anything about vaccines in the past or vaccines now that affect pregnancies? Those are questions that I never hear actual arguments. I only hear the types of arguments that, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, that I hear from creationists.
Okay.
Right? To me, that is because I feel like I was very careful to say that for me, as of right now, I think X, right? And I can only operate from the things that I know. So that to me is sort of this weird conversation of how much, for one, the amount of time for something to be credulous as far as scientific studies and the impact on the human body. All of that stuff is variable depending on the person I'm talking
to.
So I'm not even going to ask what your specific threshold is, because I already have a feeling that barring all of this other stuff, that there are many FDA approved things that you still won't take.
Sure. But there very well might be. Yeah.
Right. So if that is the case, I'm always, I guess, concerned about what else is there? Because if let's say that I do, because I didn't come in with notes or anything like that. I can't study for a test that I don't know that I'm taking.
Totally. You're fine.
But let's say that I did have the numbers on the births that have been performed on vaccinated mothers since the pandemic. And they are positive, right? That at least that is not zero evidence. We can't abstract that infinitely into the future, but we can't do that with anything.
Sure.
I'm not saying that their skepticism isn't valid in this case, because I think skepticism is valid in most of these cases. But the thing that I'm trying to, so absent that type of long-term study, are there positive pieces of evidence that can be used to justify some of these positions?
Sure. I think it would be a question of how much. Does the evidence, the evidence that you could provide, for example, there have been some, certainly some babies born, some healthy children born from vaccinated mothers, certainly. The question would be, have we played the game long enough? Is there a body of evidence enough to support something, right? And of course, there are going to be some children born with, let's just say, medical problems or complications within the pregnancy, and it's difficult to attribute them to the vaccine or not, right? You could have an autistic child that was always going to be autistic, but the fact that they're vaccinated complicates the body of evidence in a certain way. And for me, what this gets into is it's like risk tolerance. And it's both parties actually play this game very, very often. What level of risk you're willing to tolerate to do something. And it's funny that conservatives tend to look at the vaccine and they see, let's just say, some version of a risk in taking it, that there's these unknowns to it. But leftists will look at COVID, the disease in of itself, and they see a certain level of risk there where, there, despite any body of evidence, I believe that there are conservatives who will absolutely never take a vaccine no matter what. It doesn't matter what the evidence ever says, they just won't take it. And then I believe there are lefties who will, let's just say, want the government to take extreme action regarding COVID until there are zero COVID deaths, that they will not tolerate the risk of a single death. And in both cases, you can make the argument that a certain level of risk needs to be tolerated, right? And I don't know. It's interesting that I think both parties are actually playing this game at the exact same time. They're talking about different topics, right? I don't think you believe that we live in a world where we can ever achieve zero COVID deaths. That's not going to happen. People are definitely going to die from COVID. there's just a certain level of risk that you're willing to tolerate there. And I don't know. It's very frustrating that this seems to be one of the poles that we can never agree on, like left and right, is what precisely people are willing to tolerate. And I think risk of sacrificing freedoms is one of the risks that conservatives are not willing to tolerate, like in any capacity whatsoever. And one idea, I think we've danced around this like 3 or 4 times, but we've talked a lot about effectively what is the cost of freedom. You know, what do you think we have to pay to be free? And what's your definition of freedom? I think that's really central to everything that we're talking about here. And I think the far right and the far left have very, very different views on not only the definition of freedom, but the price that they're willing to pay for it. And then again, their risk tolerance for things like exogenous chemicals put into their body versus people dying from a flu, you know? It's very complicated.
Yeah, but I feel like oftentimes, like, in a very cynical way, you've seen that movie Network?
I've not.
Oh, so you should see it because it's basically a commentary on on news. It's almost like They Live-ish is like a sort of type of commentary on how we interact with media and things like that. Basically a newscaster. Have you ever seen Newsroom on HBO?
I don't think I have. I feel like I've seen the thumbnail, but that's it.
Yeah, everybody's seen the thumbnail. Everybody's seen that little clip about like everybody, like American exceptionalism or whatever. Aaron Sorkin's a genius, but the idea is that, like, from Network at least, is like people's idea of freedom is like, you know, just leave me alone, just leave me with my television and, you know, like my little leave me my life, leave me my movies and my microwave and like the things that I like to do, and just don't bug me, just let me have my little corner and just let me live. And he's basically giving a cry for paying attention, and when things are like wrong, actually getting angry and using your voice instead of just being complacent and just watching the same old shows and tuning everything out. And it's interesting. I sort of agree with your assessment about the right and the left and as far as freedom goes, because with me, I think that I have a question for you.
Okay.
Do you think that we as human beings on a grand scale, like in the world, can actually make the world better?
Fundamentally,
do you think that?
yeah. There's so many levels to that question, right? You know what you're asking too. Fundamentally, I would say yes, with extreme limitations. Okay. And this gets into. Are you familiar with Thomas Sowell, the economist? Mm-hmm. So his description of this I like a lot. He talks about the constrained view of the world versus the unconstrained. And the constrained view would be that we're operating under natural law, that there's only so many things that we're able to affect about this world, that there are, let's just say, social hierarchies that we're never going to get rid of. Pareto distribution is another fascinating example of that, why wealth accumulates at the top to a very small percentage of people, and most people are not in that group at the very bottom. There's things like this that constrain the world that we live in. They constrain our societies, and that every attempt we've ever made to construct the world differently outside of these air quotes natural laws, they ultimately fail. And the unconstrained view of the world would be that we can effectively construct any version of humanity that we can think of. And this is really synonymous with a belief in God, a higher power, a pre-existing natural superpower that has some sort of weight on our existence here. There's some rules that cannot be bent. And then, of course, the other view would be that if it's truly unconstrained, that one day we'll quantify consciousness and we control every single aspect of this entire existence. We can construct any reality that we want to construct. And naturally, I tend to fall into the constrained view, where there's a few natural laws where I just don't see how we're going to navigate our way around them. You know, perhaps science will trample into those domains at some point, but I don't think you and I will live to see things like that.
Well, it's interesting that first, like, natural law is such a loaded term.
Very,
right?
very.
Where because I feel like some of that's sort of social. I think that we've already done things within the past 30 years that people maybe 200-300 years ago would gawk at. Either they'd call it witchcraft, or they would just not understand like how these things are possible because of how they think about the world, right? And so the view doesn't necessarily, on a surface level reading, because I haven't read what you've read and I only have that statement to work with. On a surface level reading, it doesn't allow for paradigm shifts, say. Like it's because anything that happens, you would just have that new paradigm, and then whatever you have as natural laws would sort of just be like, okay, and so now we have these aspects now that we've dealt with all these things, and these are the immutable things that are not going to change or whatever.
Okay. Well, let me frame it in a maybe a better way. If we were to have like a roadmap of human culture and society, are we discovering a pre-existing roadmap? Like, do the parameters by which we need to live ideally, did they already come built into the structure of this universe, and we're merely decoding the universe and how it works and how we can best live within it? Or are we creating the map of how to live in this universe actively? That's another way to say it. Yeah, that's a big one.
So I would say then that what we do is we abstract those maps.
Okay.
So that it needs we could call the internet an abstraction or a fractal of like aspects of the life that we had in analog terms. Any newspaper, any type of like communication or anything like that is, because all of that stuff like is only real in that particular substrate. It's not material in the same type of sense.
But it's an abstraction. Yeah.
Correct. And so when we talk about things like cryptocurrencies or video games or any of these things, so now I'm sort of getting fairly postmodern here, but like, I think that's what we do. I think we deconstruct and reconstruct like a level out.
Okay.
That's what I think that's what our culture does.
We do change substrates, certainly. Crypto would be an excellent abstraction of the very concept of money, which started with cash and coins and shillings, but that could be like de-abstracted, like taking that down to its fundamental level. It's that we could value our labor and save it and trade it for a future,
sure.
Right? Like, so we're bargaining with the future. We're claiming that there's value to labor. That would be the level of analysis where you'd say, well, there's the natural law, right? The natural law is that we can barter with the future, right? That seems to be like that's a weird substrate because we got to have a thing to hold in our hands. So then we talk about cash, and then eventually we said, well, it's dumb to walk around with these pieces of paper, so now it's crypto, and we continue to scientifically abstract these same ideals. But is the ideal of bartering with the future and saving and storing the value of your labor, that seems to be non-negotiable? Is there a world where even that rule can be bent and broken, or is that a natural law?
Well, it depends. I feel like when we talk about like the word value, for instance, that's not something that like in and of itself, like value has meaning. But as far as labor goes, our relationship to it has definitely changed. So if you're talking about your labor specifically, again, like I feel like I'm having conversations like from my blackness, I guess, just remembering that slaves existed. And if we're talking about culture, where generatively would slaves fit? And at least they weren't. So the question is changing a little bit from who gets the value, like who gets the profit from that. I actually was trying to go into a more of a postmodern thing to have those types of abstractions without a basis, which is the idea of like Baudrillard and the like, where we're talking about how we interact with things in a very hyper real sense, but they're not signifying anything in real life.
So that's a fully constructionist view is where you're getting. Yeah.
Okay, parasocial relationships in social media would be a great example.
Okay.
Because relationships are something else that have been abstracted by the internet. Internet dating is, I guess, the easy example, but in all of the ways that we would say that we are in a relationship with each other, friendships, romantic connections, like all of those things have fundamentally changed. Like we don't talk to each other in the same ways. I mean, texting is a great example, and now I sound like a freaking boomer. But there are things that are lost. Eye contact, tone of voice, all of these things, and so they're not only open to interpretation, but like they are interacted with as though they are, I don't know, like, I'm not saying that true human connection isn't possible in those ways. It's just we almost change the definition of connection whenever we talk about connection in that way. Right?
Yeah.
If we're only talking about like dopamine states and the way that our brain processes like systems of like reward, like that good feeling that we get, that's not, we may get that to some extent, but that's not how my mother and father interacted with each other, and that's not the foundation that they built their life on. That's not any like the ways that we learn about our partners and grow, and the evidence that we use to decide that we're going to be with a person. I feel like somebody that existed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s would have a good argument to say that they were built on a much more solid foundation in many cases than people are now. I mean, there are completely different and contrasting arguments to that.
Sure.
But I am a little old-fashioned in that respect. I prefer what I can like have right here and actually interact with, where less is lost.
Sure. This is yeah, we're dancing around quantifying consciousness too, right? To truly understand if we can, let's just say, completely and entirely manipulate these reward systems to a degree where you can't tell the difference between the experience of someone dating face to face in the 50s and 60s versus, I don't know, hacking your nervous system and dating purely through in a digital realm somehow, right? Like, can we ever truly replicate what it is that the people in the 50s and 60s and for all of human history were experiencing? Can science ever truly replicate that substrate, whatever that connective feeling is? I think that you and I won't live long enough to see such a thing. And so your nostalgia that you described for that let's just say analog connectivity is pretty valid, because there's nothing that really competes with that exists just yet. I think the question, talking like the furthest progressive left would be, do you think that's coming? Do you think we will live to see where some of these analog, air quotes, like traditional human experiences can be manipulated by science to a degree where you can no longer tell? You can no longer tell the difference whatsoever, right? And in which case, if that's the case, then we do construct humanity in its entirety. That's not my belief. I think we're still operating in obedience to some sort of law that we don't fully understand yet. But that is the hinge here, I think.
It's interesting that like whenever I was talking about like our relationship to like the analog, we're both musicians. Like the obvious parallel is not only the romanticization of like the past and when things were analog, with tape and like master and with records, like physical records, but like Euro rack synthesizers and analog drums over digital drums would be the most obvious thing.
Yes.
Even the war of like in-person instruction over
online instruction,
even the difference between like buying video packs and having a coach, right? Because now I am out of that game. I don't see anybody in real life anymore. All of my lessons have moved to Zoom, and I do my best to supplement with like different video angles or whatever, but I can't put my hands on your hands. You can't see every single angle of how I'm holding the stick.
Correct.
There are certain subtle pitch variations in the practice pad that's much easier to get whenever you're right there versus whenever you're in the room. Like all of these little things. And it's like, it's inarguable that things are lost. It's just that, is it, with the freedom argument, are those things worth keeping for the trade-off of being able to reach, for your case, not being constrained by time. That is the gift of recording recording lessons beforehand and selling them, because not only can you teach anybody at whatever time of day, but you can teach them simultaneously. And so like your it's no longer constricted. Your sellability, your profitability is no longer constrained by the same time constraints as I get it.
Yeah.
You know,
I uncomfortably dance in those two worlds all the time because I'm quite analog in many of my views. You know, I enjoy being a human, for a lack of better words. I enjoy a lot of organic activities, you could say. I like the connectivity, and I value some of the, let's just call them like sacred human experiences that science doesn't really have a way to replicate or touch just yet. So I'm with you. I dance in both of those worlds. It's a double-edged sword. All progression in technology is certainly a double-edged sword, and it's tough to know what deal we're making as we're making it, right? Like, what specifically have we left behind when the drum machine was first invented, when someone first discovered that we can use binary code to program music? What precisely is the deal that we have made with the universe here? And it's unknowable. It's unknowable. And in many ways, this conversation is us trying to discuss what exactly that deal is. So what deal is it that we're actually making? And if only we had a time machine, we would clearly see, like, well, here's how the experiment turns out. Turns out we can quantify all of this, and, you know, we can actually improve humanity, which is one of the questions that you asked. We can improve humanity to a degree that you couldn't imagine. We can not only improve it, we can perfect it. Isn't it fucking fascinating how many times you can loop these varying topics and eventually abstract all the way to, like, is God real or not?
I know,
basically,
but, like,
where you fucking land every single time.
It's awesome, but it's also, if God is real or not has nothing to do with what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. Like, you know,
or everything to do with what you're going to have for dinner tonight.
Right. You know, it's like, oh my gosh, because so if you're talking about like some type of like divine determinism, because I mean, I don't think that. So here I am back with Sam Harris. This idea. What are we talking about when we're talking about free will? Because I feel like it's hard, unless you're a Calvinist, it is hard to parse a scientific understanding of the universe plus consciousness as an emergent property of the universe. Now, if you don't believe that, if you believe that like consciousness is like a fundamental force, or even more like consciousness is like the universe is actually conscious to some extent, then you don't fall into this category. But if you don't, and you're thinking that consciousness is like a property of existence, like a biological emergent property of the universe, then it's hard to get out of determinism. It really is. Like, this is the one thing that I agree with whenever I hear apologists talk on YouTube or wherever. I think that they're right. I just don't think that it is as it's as nihilistic as they think. I don't think that, because it doesn't do anything to affect.
Okay.
I still have something that appears like choice in a very like Dan Dennett sense, like in a compatibilist type of sense.
Sure.
Where what we want or what we treasure is the feeling that we are in control of our actions and the ability to hold actors responsible for their actions.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam Harris's argument on free will is undoubtedly one of the strongest that's ever been pitched, all the way to the origin of thought, how everything seems to appear from from nothing. You know, trying to pin down your free will is an impossible task. It's really almost impossible to actually pin it down, which is a stronger argument for the atheistic view of the world, because why on earth would God create beings that do not have agency? That seems to be closer to like a description of simulation theory. Like, is he playing a fucking video game? Like, if we don't originate our thoughts and have agency to make these decisions, then what in the world is the game even for?
Right.
Which comes with that nihilistic sprinkle in there as well. But, you know, as Sam Harris describes it, even that realization of that belief is almost beautiful in a sense, because it grants you the ability to be the observer in a certain way, and even to be the observer of something so magnificent, let's just say. There's beauty in that as well, and whatever choice you may have within that game, well, it's hard to pin down exactly where that is, but if you believe you have any at all, then, you know, best of luck. Like, enjoy the ride, you know, that sort of thing.
If we're talking about games, it's easy to switch all the way back to COVID. And if we're in COVID, so the game in the Garden of Eden, let's say, in the biblical narrative, is different than the game that we have in the American system. Like, the game, according to me, was that that God, the Christian God, put like Adam and Eve in a garden with rules, without, but not really the necessary understanding for the consequences of their actions, right? And in agent, at least in a legal sense, that is really, really important for the responsibility argument. Like, for us, we consider like the rational consequences of our actions to be a huge point, a pivot point of how we feel, like how we deem who's responsible for what. If something goes awry completely and it could not have been predicted by anybody, then we either call those things tragedies often. Right? If we can separate things like intent or negligence or malice from them, then they're tragedies without a person that we point a finger to. And in that way, the Garden of Eden is the worst case for a God putting in like children into a situation, and then you have a whole Christian tradition that says that these children are the reason that like millions, if not billions, of people are going to hell.
Sure, and you're absolutely right, because how could you prescribe it's easier to prescribe ignorance than it is, you know, malice or negligence in some case, because obviously they did not know. It's a lot closer to children who did not have a proper grasp on the consequences of their action. And to say that dictated the moral landscape for the rest of eternity doesn't make any fucking sense at all. I think it's my interpretation of Adam and Eve is far more of like a primitive metaphorical narrative that is certainly not void of error, but that it's far more of like an abstracted thing. And this is a game that you and I probably spent a few decades playing with the Bible, of like how easy it is to kick the legs out from under certain stories like this. I've grown to look at it a touch more in the metaphorical sense, where I think, given the knowledge at the time, what this story was intended to represent, is there a core fundamental truth to it? And if I can abstract that, I'm interested in abstracting that and then throwing away the rest.
Right. But my point, I think, is not to say that American citizens are necessarily children, but they're at least ignorant on like molecular and biological like sophistication, to not necessarily to be scientific children in the face of an epidemic or a pandemic.
Well, it's hard. You're talking about a lot of faith and trust in back to flat earthers, things we don't understand, tools we can't verify, chemicals I don't know the name of. Yeah.
I guess more about how we assign responsibility, I guess. Like, are we in the position to truly be responsible for that type of thing, given our lack of understanding of that thing?
Sure. That's a complicated wormhole. Absolutely. So, dude, I would love to close out with, and we don't have to go super hard on this topic, but I would love to close out briefly on the concept of race and group identity in general, because I have a feeling we don't line up on that, but I also know that you don't strike me as a person who's easily offended, and I have a feeling that you trust I have a good will for this conversation, despite any disagreements we may have.
Go for it.
So you've mentioned a couple of things like your blackness or speaking as a black man, things like that. And I'm curious, to what degree do you attribute your identity to your race?
That's a really interesting question, because I feel like a lot of that is cultural, right? It's the fact, it's not just the fact that I'm black, but blackness is so race is a social construct. That's the first thing. That's my belief in race. I don't think that there are true biological differences or like sufficient biological differences to say that I'm different from me or different from any other person, right?
But we could certainly say, well, just to clarify, we could certainly say there are biological differences in, let's just say, the amount of melanin in your skin would dictate a different color, and that would change your predisposition to skin cancer. Right?
True.
I mean, that certainly is a racial distinction that's valid.
True. But I wouldn't draw a different classification because, oh my gosh, I have to be kind of careful here, because there are historically, race has been used a lot like species was used.
Yes.
Right?
Sure.
And we both know that we don't mean race that way. Like we are similar enough that we could, I mean, if one of us were female or, had a brother or a sister, like our clans could intermingle without a biological concern. Right?
Correct.
And that would say nothing else. Like they would be a healthy individual and they would be, welcome into the world as a person, as a human person. I mean that race is one of those things where, okay, if an immigrant comes from Africa and they have the same skin as I do, they're not black in the same sense as I'm black. But the thing that we mean by race, the thing that I mean by race, is not merely based on appearance. It's based on how I interface with the society that I am in, and how it interfaces with me.
Okay.
I forget if there was a question in there or not.
Okay, well let me frame it. Let me frame it in a conservative sort of light. So,
sure.
If you were to tell me that you were black and nothing else, I try to assign a percentage of how much do I know this person. What can I abstract about this person based on their blackness and nothing else? And given the nature of the individuals that I know, my entire life experience, I don't know what else to say other than absolutely nothing. That I know nothing about this person, right? Especially if we're just going to reduce it to skin color. Obviously, culture certainly plays a role. If you said that they were a black person from if we confine it to a geographic area and a certain time period, then I can certainly take a lot more from that. But without going too far back in history, if we just said right now, like a black American, I don't know if we're talking about the president or if we're talking about a guy in jail or if we're talking I don't know, right?
That is a very optimistic way of thinking about things. And so the one thing, there are two things I can't do. For one, you're right. You're absolutely right. Like statistics are meaningless when it comes to individual interactions. I think that is the biggest area of misunderstanding when it comes to talking about these types of issues. Just because you know certain black people or you've had certain experiences, that actually doesn't always abstract to an accurate picture of how a certain group's relations in a culture is, right? That doesn't give you any facts about like the social relationship of that group.
Okay.
That's and Sam Harris actually makes a very similar point when he talks about how like dealing with people as individuals, because statistics don't tell you about the person that's looking you right in the face, right?
Correct.
What it does give you is probabilities. It does
Correct.
give you it does tell you certain truths in a probabilistic sense. For one, that I'm probably not going to live as long as you. I might. I'm not saying that I won't, but I probably won't, just given my I'm a male black person. Like, that is just a statistical fact.
Sure. You probably have slightly higher testosterone than me. You probably, yeah, right. We could make a long list of probabilities based off of group statistics. Yeah.
Absolutely. So those probabilities, colloquially are called stereotypes. Mm-hmm. And stereotypes, whether or not they are they speak to anything objectively true, have functioned in certain institutions in the United States for a long time. And we have slowly started to figure out where those things are and how to address them. Now, with any type of movement, there is always going to be reactionary concerns that we are moving too far or that we are overemphasizing a particular concern. Now, the overemphasizing that particular concern I have seen from being on the left has been that has been the way to write off the conversation without going into the details, right? I talk to a lot of people that have no, so you can say that, okay, because Barack Obama was president, then there is racism must be a marginal concern of most Black Americans in the United States. But that is the individual again and not the statistic. That's the same thing that I was saying earlier. Like, what does Barack Obama specifically tell you about the Black community in general? Doesn't tell you anything.
Well, it speaks more to the country. It doesn't speak to his group. I think Barack Obama's, just the fact that there was a black president, certainly would speak to the potential of the country, the environment, the platform in which he was raised. It speaks to that that potential, in which that group of the black community certainly does exist. I think, and I mean, certainly we agree that the nature of an individual cannot speak to the group, and you can only abstract like statistical truths about, or like you said, colloquially, we would call those stereotypes, right? But my question would be, if we were to ditch the groups entirely, we just say we're not looking at the groups whatsoever, and we go pure hardcore individualism, which in my eyes, you don't need to look further than Martin Luther's argument for content of character and not color of skin, right? I mean, just really down the middle individualism. What precisely is left over that's not solved? If such a view of individualism was applied in every system, in every faction of government, in every business, does that not solve any and all race problems? Assuming that the true actual racists are just going to die off eventually, because we can't play thought police; those people are real. But on a systematic level, implementing individualism, does it not solve all race problems?
Well, it depends on what you think the race problems are, and it depends on there are a couple of things. The issue is implementation always. Like, how do you ensure fair and unbiased hiring practices? That would be a good place to start. Like, what would be a reasonable way of saying, okay, look, like, all we're going to do is look at these sets of figures. We're not going to even look at the person's name. We're not going to look at the person's picture or anything like that. We're
pure meritocracy.
Pure meritocracy, right? So what you're talking about is removing race from a lot of forms, a lot of hiring forms, a lot of all of this stuff, which I actually kind of agree with. I think that
I'd absolutely be in favor of that.
But the thing that you would have to do is you'd have to revamp certain structures that already have practices. You're talking about there are places that still give preferential loans. Now, I'm not saying those things are legal. This is where certain debates, I've seen debates go off the rails.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Where somebody will say, well, these people do this. And they'll say, well, show me the law that says that that's cool. I'm like, well, okay, there is no law. Then what are you talking about? Okay, so why aren't regulators or whatever enforcing or going after those places? Why don't we have the arm of racial justice because what we do, we only seem to fix loud problems, right? We seem to anytime that there is true racism, what I mean by true racism, because so my neighbor is a police officer, right? A black police officer at that. We've had, oh my gosh, probably the most transformative conversation about policing in this country that I've ever had was with him.
Okay.
And I learned a lot of things about that I didn't know. For instance, that police standards are not federalized. Police operate completely differently in my town than they do the town over, and your town, and New York, and Ohio, and all of these other places. And as soon as you hear a situation about altercation with a police officer, all of the concerns aren't equal. There's no police union down here, really. And they don't have the same, and the police unions in the Midwest don't operate the same as they do in New York, for instance. And so that blue line of silence is something that people are concerned with, but they are more likely to be the case in New York than somewhere like in Ohio.
Okay.
Right. All of these little nuances of things but most of the time the media paints this broad brush picture that we tend to treat all cops everywhere the same, which is a concern for me as being a black person already being fed this whole I should be fearful of the police in general.
Sure.
Right? And
yeah.
The fact is here in my town, I probably shouldn't fear the police as much as if I lived somewhere else.
Yeah, this is one of the problems I have with and you haven't made any of these statements, but very large sweeping blanket statements about race in the entire country. You can definitely debunk some of those sweeping statements by saying, well, where precisely were you, right? Because your likelihood to be treated a certain way based off of merely the color of your skin and nothing else by a police officer would undoubtedly change depending on where you are, right? I mean, if you want to go to the middle of nowhere in Alabama to an entirely white town as a black man, I have no problem conceding that you will probably be treated differently here based off of the color of your skin and nothing else. You can find that level of racism in that part of the world. But we can go, I know that as a white person, I definitely can't walk down Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Detroit. I'm going to get fucked up because of the color of my skin. That's a real thing too. So and I know you're very aware that these conversations are far more nuanced than the media likes to paint them out. You describe them as painting with a very broad brush, and it's never ever that simple. I think the way I look at it is, in my life, I have always treated people as individuals. Even in my own mind, I've had a hard time placing people into these particular groups and thinking of them that way. And so it's almost like if you were to I had this discussion with a liberal friend of mine a while ago where he was talking about, let's just say, a hypothetical black woman who had 2 kids. She was a single mother, and she was disadvantaged in category A, category B, category C. She had everything stacked up against her. Mm-hmm. And he was speaking about all of these things, all of these systems that ultimately leave her just high and dry. She's fucked no matter what she does. But I asked him, what would you say to this woman? Let's just call her Mrs. Johnson. If Mrs. Johnson came in here and sat in front of you as an individual to an individual, I don't think you would say any of the same things to her. I think you would actually give her much more of a motivational American spirit, sort of a conservative ideology that you can pick yourself up by the bootstraps. We can take advantage of this, this, and this. Here's what we can change. Here's the garden that we can touch and manifest things in our own life. And you would you would speak to that woman as though she was not part of the group. You would want to empower her as an individual to beat all of those statistical odds that are against her. That's how any rational, kind person would speak to an individual within that group. But we sometimes speak to the group identity as though there are no individuals within it. And if there were, and you spoke to them, I don't know that we would have the same advice. Like imagine, even if you believed that fundamentally black people were an oppressed group of people at statistical disadvantages, even if I believed that, I don't know that I would ever say that and that alone to an individual black person. I wouldn't dare say that to them. Even if I believed it was true, I would have a very different message, right?
Oh, sure. But, you know, it's almost like, what conversation are we having? Like, are we having the conversation that, like, on an individual level, how we should treat people? Or are we having the conversation like, here are the policies that we should vote for because we understand, like, the specific types of things that this group has to deal with? Like, you know, you going and talking about this woman that's disadvantaged, and what you would say to her, you know, being in a position where you really couldn't do anything else to help, say, you know, you're not a financial planner, or you don't work in loans or whatever. You can't do anything materially. Like, the way that I would talk to her, understanding her situation, but being extremely like I wouldn't just say pick yourself up by your bootstraps.
Maybe not that catchphrase. Yeah.
You know, yeah, because it's like, okay, there are so many problems there, and some of these are cultural. I don't want to put it all on America, because that would be extremely easy to do. Like, the fact that, like, there are still communities in this country that are dealing with the implications of redlining, and the loans that their families could and couldn't get, and where they were allowed to live, and the communities that have underperforming schools because for some strange reason education is tied to property taxes, and so you have poor areas, and you're going to have poor underprivileged schools, and those kids are going to not perform as well because of those situations. Like, that is a real material thing that we can talk about, and talk about, like, solutions on how to fix. That's not in any way an individual issue. Like, I'm not going to go to a kid and lecture him on state economics. I'm going to say, let me see if I can buy a book for you. Let me see if, like, I can find a tutoring program for you, or find some volunteers that can help fill the gaps of your struggling school, see if we can help. Like, that, those are the types of situations. And so, but I feel like all the time in these types of conversations, the individual level and the structural level or the group level are often conflated, to say that, like, and the same thing with your side. If we're talking about, like, let's say that white people are privileged, right? What people here are, you specifically, Adam, are, you've had things handed to you, and you don't know how good you have it. Instantly, this is what happens. You get defensive, because you know how hard you've worked in your whole life. You know that you have struggled, and you know that you have put much thought and much discipline into reaching the level of success. You don't think that anyone has handed you a goddamn thing. And anytime you hear anything about privilege, even though you accept the fact that as an American on the world stage, you are privileged in a different way to be a part of, let's say, how did you describe the United States earlier? Like that, like being a part of, like, the cultural center and the richest nation of the world. That itself provides you with opportunities that you would not have if you lived in another country and lived in a poorer country. And those types of and we're usually talking about privileges not made necessarily on that scale, because that scale, GDP wise and everything else, like, our cultures are much closer than, let's say, some failed state somewhere.
Sure.
Right. Sure. But it's the type of privilege that we're more likely talking about than someone coming, like, putting their arm around your shoulder, saying like, come here, boy, I have something to give you. And you're like, you don't have to worry about a thing like that.
Sure,
I feel like that is
sure.
like a caricature of what most people mean when they say privilege.
One of the interesting criticisms that you're making, and it's probably valid, is that what type of privilege are we talking about? And you're saying that someone in my position might often personalize it, where you're saying, well, I know how hard that I've worked, yet simultaneously I do accept that I'm privileged to be an American. And there's an irony there, because I'll grant you some privileges and get hyper defensive off of others, right? And I do see that irony, but I think the proper level of analysis is always on the individual, because if we were to let's take the left concept of intersectionality, where we could have, I've given this analogy on this podcast before, but let's just say that we have, we got 4 parameters. We've got black women. We could find out how they're oppressed, certainly. Or let's just say black, that's the parameter. Then we have women. Then we have disabled, right? People in wheelchairs. Then we have like low IQ. So these are 4 different types of oppression that one could have. And you have 4 separate groups of people, 4 group identities. But then we could take where they intersect, and we could take a group of disabled black women, right? And then we could throw on top of there that they're gay. So this is like a super intersectionality conversation here, right? We've got a very, very oppressed group of people. But even among that group of clearly oppressed people, there is a hierarchy of oppression, because we just have to find the one who has the lowest IQ among the group, and they are therefore the most oppressed person. It's sort of a route back to individualism, in that no matter which privileges I grant and which ones I don't, ultimately I am an insanely complex recipe of advantages and disadvantages, most of which I have no control over. So if I were to grant you my white privilege, you would have to grant me 1,000 other versions of oppression that I could list for you that are hyper unique to me. My parents got divorced when I was young. I broke a bunch of bones when I was a young kid. I got in a car accident at this point. I was actually super introverted at this period in my life. I had a horrible breakup and experience, right? Like, I have this list of advantages and disadvantages that is so hyper complex that it almost seems like to throw me in a group based off of any one privilege seems to be not telling the whole story. So, for example, if we use your blackness to put you within some sort of an oppressed group, well, you're also very intelligent, very, very intelligent. So even within the group identity of let's just say oppressed black people, you would be very, very high within that hierarchy, right? You're certainly less oppressed than someone with a lower IQ than you. Like, it's like, which privilege or disadvantage are we going to focus in on? And then how complex is your recipe, right?
I hate the word oppression.
Okay.
I hate the word oppression because I hate the implication that there is an oppressor. Right. I feel like
anti-Marxist.
That
yes,
has that it has so much baggage to it.
It does.
Right?
It does.
The fact that there's somebody doing something to us, right? Oppression, as far as I understand it, is just the negative ways that we interface with our society, or ways that we would interface that give ourselves that present a unique challenges that other people don't have.
Okay.
Right? So I would love to reframe this argument, because here's the thing. I think that we should live in a society that addresses all of the stuff that you were talking about. I would love more a comprehensive, mental health oriented look on like human beings in general. Mm-hmm. And I would love that to permeate not just our educational system, but our like corporations too, because I think that at times we can have a unhealthy relationship with work in this country, especially so I am a child of a baby boomer, right? Like, my mom worked her ass off as like a marketing professional, and she was gone all the time, and that work ethic is something that I inherited from her, right? And so like, but at the same time, I see especially gigging musicians, people, not, the romanticized version of it, but the ones that know, like, when you have to you have a wedding coming up and you have to like cram 30 songs in a week before you can go out and make $300 or $400, and you do that like over and over and over again. Like there's this weird amount of work that we have to do networking with people only for other people to make the assumption that, oh, it's cool that you can just do the thing that you love. Oh, how nice it is to like have a hobby to that you can call, when you know how much blood, sweat, and tears actually goes into this. Mm-hmm. It's this idea that all of the things that you were talking about, I mean, even there are still doctors to this day that think that there are differences in like notable differences in pain tolerance between black and white people, so that like black people are under prescribed pain meds.
For me, in an example like that, because I've heard those arguments before, but my thing is like show me that doctor and I will gladly fight that fucking moron right alongside you. Show me that doctor. It's same with the judge.
Yeah.
Show me that judge and fuck that guy. Let's get him out of our political system or medical system, whatever.
So in any conversation that I find that I agree on those points, I find that the issues are marketing, because if we dial the temperature down just a little bit, we're not yelling at each other already, because I mean we're already fairly calm anyway, and then we take away the slogans. We take away the vast sweeping generalizations, and we talk about specific topics, and we agree on those points. Then what we tend to have by and large is a marketing problem. How do we deal with, because so it's like the Black Lives Matter of, like, people are talking about how, well, Black Lives Matter implies that like only Black Lives Matter would have been better if you did all lives matter from the beginning, and then there's Blue Lives Matter, but like only some blue lives, because what about the blue lives of the people that were in the Capitol on the 6th of January? All this
problem
stuff,
group
right?
identity. Yeah.
Exactly. Like it's this team ball thing.
Yeah.
That I'm not concerned about, right? Show me statistics and teach me the history, and I will, as best as I can, talk about individual specific issues that I care about, and because I will let all of the rest of it go. If you don't want to call us black, or you want me to use words like blackness, I'll ditch all of that stuff if it gets me to talk about specific types of reform in specific types of situations that I care about.
I think that makes you probably, at least in my own personal view, like the most rational left position that one could have, right? That it's not necessarily like that I'm clinging to some group identity necessarily, but it is the specific topic and the specific issue. And it sounds like you and I would agree there. I think the problem is, at least from a conservative perspective, it is difficult to pin those things down when we talk in the most broad, like news caption terms all of the time, which I know that's not how you and I have conversations like this. Obviously, we get, in the weeds on these sort of things, but in the big grand narrative, it never happens that way. It's always these broad strokes versus broad strokes, and we never actually unpack these issues to their core. An example of unpacking an issue to the core, though, to me, is like if you make a claim about black people being underprescribed pain medication because there are certain doctors that have this weird, pseudo-religious belief that black women have a different pain tolerance. Can we find that fucking guy and make sure that he never practices medicine again? Because that, it's same with cops. Like, show me the specific racist cop, and I will gladly show up at that march. Like, no problem. But it's when we broaden things out to the widest degree, I have a very, very hard time fighting, let's just say, racist doctors, and we can't nail beyond that.
Well, sure. And the issue is like figuring out if individual instances ever create trends. Like the issue I find is that like conservatives that tend to value, or in a sense sometimes overvalue, concepts like individualism have a hard time with sociologists, because what sociologists' jobs are to take data points and to make broader statements about populations. That's what they do. Mm-hmm. And so then it becomes, are there enough data points in that trend in a specific direction to say, oh yeah, that institution is probably racist? And if that's the case, on a marketing perspective, do you want to frame it that way?
I see, because
right now you don't.
Yeah.
You don't, because you already have like a subset of people allergic to anything that points to identity, period, right? And so how can you say that this group of people is like women are disproportionately affected by osteoporosis in their old age? Like, you could call that like a biological fact, right? Mm-hmm. But we are not to the point yet that sociological facts are viewed like scientific facts or biological facts.
But see, this is one of the problems, though, I think, is that there are, in any given situation, any given domain, let's just take the study of sociology, the amount of facts that we could abstract from that study is so close to infinite that it becomes very tricky to choose which frame you're going to look through, because we could certainly find a sociological data point that would point to a very specific trend that would say, I know you don't like the word, but like black oppression, or at least a systematic disadvantage of black people. I don't have any doubt that,
I like that one better.
Yeah, like systematic disadvantage, sure. We could find those data points, no problem. But if we wanted to find data points that would point to a different philosophical conclusion, there are many of those as well. Like, the highest GDP of black families in the entire world is in the US. Like, I mean, we could each name contrasting data points, like proving different points. It's like the amount of facts that we can abstract from the study of sociology is so close to infinite that it's like you and I can frame up any argument on either side and make it terrifyingly convincing. But it's a matter of framing. Which frame are you choosing to look through? Because if I sent you on the mission of tell me why America is good for black people, and you were purely using sociological data points, I don't think you'd run out of awesome things to list. And if I gave you the exact opposite goal, you also would not run out of things to list of why it was the most oppressive country that ever existed.
Well, it depends on what you mean by America being good, or let's say even the best for black people. Like, it's one of those things, like all of those topics would probably be the same for any racial group right now, period, just because of the specific privileges that America affords its citizens, right? And so you aren't parsing out the differences between you're not saying anything about the relationship between black people and white people in the United States, say, which is most of the time what people are talking about, right? So you could pivot easily into like this weird type of gratitude argument about black people just should be happy that they're here in the first place. Mm-hmm. Easily the thing that you could talk about is like, okay, what is the average GDP or like wealth of a black family versus a white family in this country? And that might tell you something different, even if it does break down differently by community, and you can follow those trends too. The point that I guess I'm trying to make is that I am also aware that you can manipulate statistics to tell stories.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, basically. Yeah, correct.
But the thing that I am most interested in is learning more things, because the more data points that we have, the more of a complete picture we have of the way things are in this country.
Now, my fear in you saying that, I understand the general sentiment that learning more things, the more data points you have, the more complete the overall picture would be. But when I use the word like infinite facts, I'm fearful that that is actually true, that the amount of data points that one could abstract to pitch virtually any argument are unlimited. That we could, right? That you could make, like if we were to say, like, let's just take the really base argument that like black people should be grateful to be here, which is oversimplified, but like let's just say you wanted to make that case. Like I think you could find hundreds of thousands of data points to support that argument. And if you wanted to make a case that, well, but compared to the GDP of an average white family, the black GDP is actually much lower, hundreds of thousands of data points. Like, I don't know that you will ever abstract enough of them to say I have the whole picture, because someone with an opposing view will say, well, hey, I changed my frame a little bit and I abstracted another 100,000 views for another argument. It almost leads me to believe that, like, we will not fundamentally conclude any of these debates using sociology, right? That it is almost like it's like an infinite game for some reason, because I don't know if we were to even have this like data points of your life to support if you're a good guy or a bad guy. Well, dude, if we have access to your thoughts and we're going to start making lists of good and bad things, this is infinite. This is infinite. There is no conclusion to playing that game. We're just going to keep abstracting facts, and we're just going to argue whichever set of facts we happen to frame up. I worry that the study of sociology in general and collecting these data points will never paint a complete picture, because we'll never abstract all of the facts.
Well, sure, but like facts alone don't really tell you anything. What do you want? What are you trying to say? We're back to the right and left divide, like talking about values and the type of
what are your values?
Build.
What are you trying to prove in the first place? Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
and so we're on the same. I think infinite is a useful term. I don't think that's necessarily true.
You're right.
But I understand I understand the sentiment, right? There are so many directions that you can pull something, but the issue is like there are certain things that you could disprove with those facts too. Like, I mean, there are the influx of Chinese products in this country has a disproportionate effect on the obesity in black children.
Okay.
I mean, there are black children that are obese, and we get a lot of Chinese products in this country, right? And so if I had an anti-China sentiment in so much as it was tied to my racial identity, it would be an interesting case to make.
You could make
if
that
I
case.
was trying to.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not sure if I could, because I don't know the data, right? I'm not sure. Like, this is just a hypothetical to say, it might be possible for me to find the data points that correlate with the amount of Chinese products in this country that also happens to correlate with, like,
correct,
the way that we process food and like the way that we eat and all of these other things. But we also know that correlation does not imply causation. And there are other logical frameworks that we have. Like, we have frameworks of reason to help us, hopefully, to help us parse some of the, like, the mist, some of the haze of pure facts into what are most likely rational conclusions. And what you just said just seemed a little bit too reductionist for my taste.
Sure. Well, it's I understand what you're saying. I am reducing sociology to like a game not worth playing because it's an ever. I do. I understand. I understand what you're saying for sure. But that sentiment, at least, which I know you understand, to me, this is what always routes me back to individualism, where the proper plane on which to address every problem is at the individual level, given that the amount of factors we could extract sociologically are at least close to infinite, at least in that you and I will never actually quantify all of them. I worry that data point map, if it had tens of thousands of data points, that like someone could come in with a different value set and be like, I got 10,000 more data points, like haha. And I do wonder if sociological studies, group identity thinking, even on a purely scientific level, I do wonder if that will ever paint a helpful picture as much as it will two individuals sitting down and talking to each other. Right? Like, I find this to be so much significantly more impactful than any you and I have access to groups of people, but this is the substrate of this conversation is so much more impactful than addressing the groups, or even thinking about the groups. I don't know. Does it kind of make sense?
No, absolutely. Because you tend to value, because I mean, this is the context to value that type of thing. I hope that like you find interacting with people and conversations valuable. But whenever we talk about politics, I feel like we necessarily change topics. I think that's where the right and the lefts kind of happens, where when we talk about groups, when we're talking about representation, because that's the way our government works, we're always going to be talking about like groups and not individuals. We have to, because we reduce everything so much at the congressional level and then ultimately at the presidential level, where we have these people that our system has designated as representatives to like huge swaths of people. I don't think that I think the divide is always going to be there to stay, but I don't think that we can neglect that we just live in a society of groups, and those groups are subject to change, and we will probably not live, as you said, we will not live to see the day where those groups actually change enough for them to be recognizable to us. But given how society has functioned, they will. And the people that are alive 300 years from now will be talking about completely different groups, but probably in the exact same types of terms.
Sure, you're right. And I will grant you one last thing for sure, that the groups do exist. You can't pretend that they don't. I think my pitch for individualism would be more so that the healthiest group is merely a group of healthy individuals. And that's why my level of analysis always routes me back to individuals, because I believe that healthy individuals make up the most badass groups on the planet, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and that's a whole, oh God, that's a whole different level that we can go down for sure. But dude, this was an awesome conversation. I feel like you and I just need, like you said, some bourbon and like another 4 hours or so, and maybe not even that would cut it, dude.
Yeah, I would love to do this again. This was so much fun, and I feel like it took me a while to kind of get my thoughts together.
Oh, you're good, man.
But,
and dude,
I mean, you are a great conversation leader.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. And to be honest, what I appreciate about you most is that your depth of thought is it's difficult to reach what's the way to say it? Like, you know, when you talk with people, let's just not name anybody, but people who are not as deep of thinkers, and it's frustrating sometimes when I don't have to scratch too far below the surface before I find the bottom of their thought and go, oh, that's where you landed. Like, this is where you last left off on this problem, and now I have to be responsible for taking the conversation to a new depth, and this is unexplored territory for you. But it is really refreshing to talk with someone who, like, your bottoms are low. Like, you've been to all these places before, right? So it's like, oh shit, we're not even close to like your bottom on this topic, you know? But I really enjoy that, man. It allows the conversation to be significantly more exploratory in that it's just two people just stampeding into the unknown and, you know, figuring out like, hey, you way the fuck over there? Oh shit, you're over there? Like, I like that right. Open landscape type of thing, man. So your depth of thought is really appreciated here, man. This was killer.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much. There was one thing I remember that I got chills when you said it, and it'll be interesting to go back and rewatch it.
Awesome. Hell yeah, brother.
But yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'll talk to you soon, my man.